All right, welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you and a special welcome to our guest speaker today, Robert Kies, who joins us from Ernst & Young. I want to take a moment just to acknowledge the recent atrocities in Israel. For any of you with family there, I hope they're all safe and there'll be a swift and peaceful end to this crisis. The Jewish Community Foundation has worked to identify many nonprofits in Israel that are best positioned to help right now. We included that information in the packet we sent today, and we'll continue to identify areas for support as the war continues. If you'd like to talk about how you can assist, please be in touch with us. We're here to help you and your clients make a positive impact. When times are most trying, we must also remember the healing power of community. And I want to share a short video with you that demonstrates how one person's working with us to support the community and keep her family legacy alive.
My grandparents, Doris and Abe Getzler, were two of my most favorite people in the whole world. When they passed away, I was fortunate enough to get an inheritance from them. There was a finality around it, like that was it. That was all that was left. It made me incredibly sad, actually. My husband, Ruben, had the idea of why don't we use some of the money in a way to honor them. My grandparents' philosophy around giving was very much based on who needed it the most. That really was what guided us.
We talked about a lot of different organizations, and ultimately she really liked the idea of the foundation making the choice in the area of emergency needs.
They came with like 15 suggestions, and they sent us articles and links, and they really did their research but allowed us to marinate it in as well.
Ellie ultimately decided that she wanted to do an endowment fund at the foundation because she liked the idea of having a fund in perpetuity.
My great-grandkids and great-great-grandkids and their grandkids will have the opportunity to distribute the money every year. 50 years from now, people will still be giving in their name.
Usually when somebody wants to do something charitable for a loved one, it's because the loved one was charitable in their lifetime.
After my wife passed away, the idea came to mind to set up a charitable fund that would perpetuate her work in Na'amat. It's an organization that provides many different services to women in Israel and communities within Israel. We had such pride in the works that Ivy had done. We did not want it to end with her passing. So we established the Ivy Libros Memorial Fund at the Jewish Community Foundation of Los Angeles. When you're setting up a foundation, there are many, many questions that come to the fore.
He ultimately chose the donor advised fund because it gave him total flexibility around when to make gifts out of the fund and what amounts.
I also felt a sense of direction on how to proceed, how to market this, how to achieve the best possible results. I just felt like I was at home. I'm hoping it'll be a domino effect to create increased growth and achieve the objectives that Ivy, if she were here, would be so proud of.
We are, in fact, a community. It's not just a place to hold your charitable assets. We try to help people be better in their philanthropy. That's our mission.
I see the foundation as a trusted partner because they're thoughtful, they care, they're diligent, they honor you and what you're trying to do.
If we can help you or your clients create a legacy for them or their family, please be in touch with us. This is what we try to do every day, and especially at times like this, there's opportunity to help all over the world. Earlier today, we sent you the CV and the slides for our speaker, Robert Kies. Robert has a very impressive CV and has great technical expertise with family partnerships, LLCs, S-corps, and trusts of every flavor. He also worked for Golden Boy Corporation, which I can only imagine must have been a really cool thing to do. And I can only imagine how much he regrets volunteering for this, given his workload and the tax deadline. So we owe you extra kudos, Robert, for taking the time to do this today. As a reminder, I'm going to ask everyone to send questions to me via the chat function, and we will get to them at the end, unless Robert is looking at the chat while he's doing his presentation, and then we'll get to them. But please send me the chat. And Robert, thank you again for being here, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you all. This is always, it's funny, as I've when I was younger, I always felt very scared about getting up in front of people and talking and all that, and I had to get used to that. And then I finally get used to getting up in front of people and talking. And now we're doing Zoom, so now I'm trying to get used to doing Zoom presentations. And so I'm probably more nervous now doing this kind of stuff than I was just regular talking. But so today, what we're going to talk about is the planning for migration in and out of California. This is sort of a high-end problem for people. People come and go from California all the time. People come and go from states all the time. My dad retired a few years back, moved to Florida. I don't think he was ever worried about getting an audit from Pennsylvania on his taxes. But for our clients and the type of clients that we have, this is a big concern because they're obviously very mobile, very wealthy. There's a lot of income flowing through. And Tamara, if you could go to the next slide, as we've seen over the last couple of years, the California really is having a little bit of some might say a little bit bigger than we're having a migration out of California. We're still getting a ton of people coming in, and we still have a lot of very, very wealthy people here. But there has been, I've seen it in my practice and with our people, that people are moving to other states, and especially there's a few states where obviously you've got Nevada, Texas, Florida, a few others. There's even states like Idaho, Tennessee, and so there's been a little bit of a move. And then when these people move, if there's a big enough dollar or income amount in there, there's the risk of getting audited, and that's one of the things that we've been looking at over the past. I think one of the first times I had to do this was probably about 20 some years ago, where a client of mine, a younger guy, married a woman from Puerto Rico, lived in California, actually moved to Puerto Rico, and started filing as a Puerto Rican resident. And at that time, California decided to audit. I think it took almost 10 years to resolve the audit and get a no change audit. And so we went through multiple things. And basically at the time, and I think it's still somewhat true, the California auditors, if it's close or if they have, if there's enough money involved, sometimes they'll just punt it up and you end up in the protest or appeals section and that kind of thing. If it keeps going on, you end up going up to Sacramento, sitting down, having a hearing, potentially doing a settlement. There's a whole process in place for all this kind of stuff when you potentially get audited. So the very next slide, I think, is the one where we're talking about the residency. Well, first, let me go through this. So there's three things I'm going to do. Most of what I'm going to talk about today is really the tax planning consequences and things to think about for individuals that are moving in and out. And then I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these last two slides. There's been a lot of I know there's a number of estate planning attorneys and tax attorneys in Los Angeles that have done fantastic presentations and have all kinds of great materials on the California trust versus non-California trust. I just wanted to touch on that because that is something that you do need to think about when you're coming in and out of California. There's some at least high level planning that I wanted to chat about there. And then also with regard to, I'm not going to get into the details of, apportionment and allocation and that kind of stuff with LLCs, partnerships, and S corps. But I just wanted to touch on it because there's some stuff to think about there as well. So basically, anytime you have a wealthy client that's moving either in or out of California, there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into that. It's not as easy as just buying a home over there and moving over there for the types of clients that we're talking about here today. So to start, the very first topic is the definition of residency. And when you look at that, and I think the next slide is the residency one. Yeah, so you got resident versus non-resident. And you'll see that, California, obviously, they define a non-resident by sort of saying, well, it's anything that's not a resident. And then you go to the residency thing. And then it's a two-part test in California for whether or not you're a resident. There's the resident definition, and then there's a domicile definition. So the first part is whether or not you're present in California for other than a temporary or transitory purpose. The second part is whether or not you're domiciled in California. So theoretically, and this is, for instance, back to my example before about the client that moved to Puerto Rico, California was trying to hang their hat on the domicile. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail here in a minute. But basically, the residency part is a little bit more of a day's test. And I've heard many, many times over the years, a lot of people, a lot of clients will say, well, if you're, I just need to be outside of the state of California for more than 183 days, right? And then I always say, well, yes and no, because on the one hand, that's a good starting point. And there are states that actually have, I think New York's one of them that has like a real strict, it has a two-part test too, but I think their residency test is very strict on the days. California, there is some stuff out there, written about the presumption if you're a certain amount of days and so on. And the 6 months being out of California for more than 6 months is great. However, the problem with the whole, with that thinking of saying, okay, well, we're going to be outside of California for 183 days, is that for many, many of our clients, getting 183 days in a new state is actually somewhat hard with the travel and this, that, and the other thing that goes on. There's a lot of times we'll see, clients may have 150 days in one state, and then they'll have another 120 in another day in another state. And so what ends up happening is California does not necessarily, if you don't meet 183 days in a new state, then it could be a little harder to argue about whether or not that's your new state. And I've now established my new residency there, and I've also established my new domicile there. So you have to establish basically both in order to be a non-resident of California. So the important part, and I'll get into some of the factors and so on this in a little bit, but it's very important to know that the 183 days is not necessarily the end all and be all. California won't always necessarily even agree with it, even if you do have 183 days outside the state. The domicile is another thing that they will then look at. The part-year resident then is the next definition, but the part-year resident is basically just, if you move into California, you potentially have half, a part of the year in California, part of the year not California, and then you have to get into how do you allocate the income for the two different time periods. Next slide, please. So the guidelines for determining the residency, and this is that if you're in California for more than a temporary or transitory purpose, California, and by the way, a lot of this stuff, if you go into the, and I have it at the end, but California does have two main publications. There's a publication 1031, there's also a publication 1100. Those two publications have a lot of information on exactly what California is looking for and what they're thinking about what you should be doing. The one is about determining the residency, and they have the definitions in there, they have the factors in there, they have a bunch of examples, they talk through a whole bunch of different income examples and so on. So that's a good starting point for anyone who's going to be looking at this and concerned about this kind of residency thing. The second one, the 1100, that publication is actually really good to look at to see how do you allocate your income if you're a non-resident part-year resident. Because in there, California just sort of lays out what they're looking for as far as how you allocate income between the 2 years, or between the two parts of the year. And then finally, there's also a publication. It's basically their audit manual, which is, I think, always interesting to look at if you're learning about this or thinking about this. It's called the FTB Residency and Sourcing Manual, and actually Residency and Sourcing Technical Manual. So that's also a good thing to look at because they go into great detail and basically instruct their auditors on how they're supposed to be looking at this stuff when they're doing their audit. So the underlying theory of residency is that you're a resident of the place where you have the closest connections. So then you'll see when we get to the factor section next, that's where they try to determine, okay, well, where do you hang your hat at the end of the day? Where do you come back to when you're gone for a while? Where's your family members? Where's your business? Where's your church, your temple? Where's your country club? Those kind of things. So that's what they're looking at, and they're going to look at that in a comprehensive way. The second part about, closest ties. So, basically what that part is talking about is that if you're going to be doing, if you're going to be moving to another state, you want to sort of do like, for instance, when my dad moved out of Pennsylvania, moved to Florida. If you think about it that way, it's like he sold his house, moved to Florida, bought a house, started doing things down there, got doctors, got dentists, and so on. So that's, if you think about it that way, you basically, where do I live and where do I spend most of my time? What grocery stores do I go to? Those kind of things. And then they talk about and then this is what I was talking about before about the different factors, strength of the ties, all those kind of things. Next slide, please. All right, so here's the factors, and these are basically listed right out of the California publication. So, the amount of time you spend in California versus the amount of time you spend outside of California. That, in my experience, is actually probably the biggest thing and the most important thing to look at, even though I was saying earlier about the 183 days, you can't necessarily count on that and only count on that. That is basically the very first thing they look at and the driving force behind it. So if you're going to ever be looking at this or thinking about getting in or out of California, thinking about it, the very first thing you think about is, okay, I'm going to have to look at my days. Second thing is the location of your spouse, registered domestic partner, and children. That might sound a little funny because usually if people move, they move with their spouse and children, but we have had situations, and I've seen situations, I had a situation in my extended family where the husband and wife lived apart because of their jobs, and they would get together. I have a client right now who's engaged, and they're both in their second marriage, and they're going to be, one lives in Florida, one lives in California. So they're going back and forth. They're spending like 1 weekend in California, 1 weekend in Florida, sometime together, sometimes it can be two. So they're going to be thinking about, they're basically going to be living in different spots, at least for the near future. So that's, it does happen. And so you just have to take those kind of things into account. Location of your principal residence. That's, pretty obvious. Where do you have your house? I'll get into that a little bit more too. I have another slide on that as well when we come up. State that issued your driver's license. As funny as that sounds, that's one of their immediate first questions that they ask. So that's important to do. A lot of people move and just don't get the, don't switch the license at first. It's always good to switch the license around the time that you're moving, so that you basically have contemporaneous proof that, hey, I moved to this other state and I signed up for this new license. Same thing with the vehicles being registered. Where do you maintain your professional licenses? That's not necessarily as big depending on what you're doing with your professional license. But obviously if there's if you can't practice, if you move to Texas, say, and you're an attorney and you can't practice law down there, that could be, one of the things that they would look at. So you got to look at where your professional licenses are. And if it matters, there's a lot of CPAs, for instance, out there, or a lot of attorneys who go in-house or something like that. They don't necessarily even have to be active. So those are the kind of things. State where you're registered to vote. That sort of goes right along with the driver's license. When you register your driver's license in the new state, you should, register to vote in the new state. And also give up your vote out here in California. And one of my clients moved to Nevada, and he did everything right because he's very very thorough and all the stuff he did. And he was telling me, so he was very concerned about the whole voter fraud thing, because he's like, you know what, I was getting he was getting the mail-in ballots in both Nevada and California, so he was getting them in both places. But at the very least, you should register to vote in your new state. Location of the banks where you maintain accounts. I think that's a little bit of an outdated concept in today's world. Most of us, if we're going to move, we wouldn't necessarily. All the bankers and investment guys and this, that, and the other thing. So some people don't even, they won't even have an ATM. But speaking of the ATM, if you're going to have an ATM card, you should use your ATM card in the new state. But that's something that if you can, I'll get into that a little bit more later, but basically that's one of the things they at least used to look at. I've never really had them question that over the years. Next slide, please. Origination point of your financial transactions, that actually is important. I'll get into that in a minute. Location of your medical professionals, other healthcare providers, accountants, attorneys. They will look at that. They will ask that when they're auditing. They'll ask, where's your doctor? Where's your dentist? Who's signing your tax return? Where's your lawyer? Social ties. That's another one where they all. Actually, the funny thing is all of these factors on here in the audits I've had over the years, they actually have asked every single question that is in these factors. And so that's why I think it's important to look at that publication 1031, because I have a feeling what they do is they have a list and they go right down that list and they ask for this stuff. They'll say, okay, where's your country club? Let me see a list of your country club. Let me see, where your place of worship is and those things. And what board members, are you on any board members? And they ask these open-ended questions. So basically you have to think about that. Location of real property investments, permanence of work assignments in California. And lately, actually, I think they updated their publication to say they would take into account the pandemic related issues because some people literally might have been stuck in one place or another for a little while because of the different various lockdowns throughout the state. So that's sort of going to go away though here soon. And the work assignments, that is a little bit more. There's actually been some case law out there. There have been some people that have left. I've seen it, when I've done research on this over the years, I did see, like, for instance, I saw they actually got a guy, he went to Singapore for a year, worked, came back. And he had somewhat planned to stay in Singapore, but it was unclear. There was some confusion on that. The facts that he had weren't as exactly clear as they would have, as we would have liked. It basically California said no. You were only gone for a year and you didn't plan to stay there. It was just temporary. So that gets back to the temporary and transitory. They also look at that as well when you leave the state. Is it temporary and transitory, and you mean to come back? So in that case, they basically were looking at it and saying, well, you never really gave up your domicile. You just left for a temporary work assignment. You really lived here. The real property investments is also something that I'm going to get to in a minute as well when I go through some suggestions. Next slide. Okay, so the definition of domicile is really vague. So you can read it here. It's basically, they have this part about where you're going to be making your true, fixed, permanent home, where you're absent, you intend to return. That's basically sort of what I was just talking about with the guy with his temporary work assignment going over to Singapore and coming back. If you leave temporarily, this happens sometimes with, you've probably seen there's been some cases out there with some of these athletes that maybe, in California, but then they go to another, they might get traded or something like that. They go to another team for a little while, but then they never really give up their home in California. So this domicile is something that is a little, I don't know if anyone could really ever say, okay, well, this is the exact definition. Here's exactly how you're supposed to be interpreting this. They will basically look at that, and it's in a sense, it starts getting into all the different factors and all that kind of stuff. I would argue that a lot of it revolves around, where's your family, where's your closest connections, where's your dog, that kind of stuff. And then they will look at that and they'll use this domicile as sort of the backup to whether or not they're going to argue that you're, still in California and still owe California tax. So the next slide. Okay, so you can only have one domicile at a time. So in other words, you can't live in two different places at once. And then they list out what they think you should do. You're supposed to abandon your prior domicile, which is why a lot of people, when you hear people talk about things, they'll say, well, you should probably just sell all your houses in California and so on, and sort of just go back to the simple of, well, I used to live in LA, but now I moved to Phoenix. I sold my house here. I moved over to Phoenix. I've abandoned my old home. I haven't kept any kind of, I haven't kept like sort of an anchor with me back in my old state of California. Physically moving to and residing in the new locality is obviously very important. I've heard of, I've seen people try to, say maybe get an apartment somewhere, and meanwhile they still have a huge home in Bel Air, Beverly Hills, and so on, and then they get an apartment in Miami, and they say, well, no, my Miami apartment is my new place, but they're not physically necessarily moving all of their stuff there. They might have, might be temporary and that kind of thing. And then really at the end of the day, the last thing with the domicile is just the intent to remain in the new locality permanently. And that's really a question of intent in a sense. And because I've had cases where, I've had a client that literally did pick up and move to another country, and they intended to stay there. But then after a year, they realized, you know what, we made a huge mistake. We don't actually like living here as much as we thought we would. We're going to come back. But at the time they had moved, they had sold their home. They had permanently, said they were going to leave. They came back, bought a new home, and then we're in California again after a year. But they had to, at the time they intended to, they sort of met all these tests. They physically moved, they abandoned their prior domicile, and they intended to stay over there. So those were the three things that you look at with the domicile. And again, it's very vague. You just sort of have to look at the totality of the factors. Next slide. Okay, so here's some of the things to consider. This goes along with the factors. I sort of covered some of this stuff already, but I'll just, I get into a little bit more detail here. So I always recommend that you keep a meticulous log of your, and contemporaneous too, by the way, of your calendar days and locations. The very first thing that that the FTB will ask for in any kind of, when they're looking at this, is they're going to ask for your calendar. They want to see where your days are. They will actually make up their own calendar, and based on some of the other stuff that we talked about before. So they will ask to see your calendar. They're going to want to see your travel logs. They're going to want to see your plane information. So, especially if you have a private jet, they're going to want to see the private jet information. Where did it take off? Where did it go to? Who was on the plane with you? They will ask all of these things. They'll ask for the hotel receipts. They want to know that. Nowadays, there are new tracking apps that you can put on your phone that will track, and you can add additional support to where you actually are. So you'd have a sort of a belt and suspenders. You would have your calendar that you keep, your meetings, those kind of things on the calendar. You'd have your travel log, and then you'd have your travel app. So between those three things, you should be in pretty good shape. From what I understand, the travel apps are a little, they're a little glitchy here and there, but it's worth looking into. And then the other thing to be cognizant of, and this is where they might try to make up their own calendar. I've seen this before, where they'll ask for, they want to see the credit card statements and the bank statements, and they want to see where your purchases are. So that goes back to that one slide, the factor that I mentioned in the other slide, where they want to see where your financial transactions are originating. So if you say that if your calendar says one thing, but then on your credit card, it's showing that you were at you were at a restaurant in Los Angeles, or you were buying gas in Los Angeles, and you're, doing this or the other thing under, they will make up their own calendar and then basically say, well, here's where we think you are. So, based on your credit card statements, here's where you were. So it's just cognizant, what you want to be is you want to be, cognizant of what your credit cards are saying and what they're doing there. And a lot of times what I've seen this before too in family office type situations, is sometimes other people will have a credit card besides the main person. It'll be one big account, but there'll be like multiple accounts, and there'll be multiple people, sometimes like the housekeeper or the assistant, the gardener, something like that. They could be using the credit card. And it could be that they're just maintaining something, like maintaining the house. If you don't sell your house when you leave and you keep a house, you might have something there. So there's just things like that to think about. It's just they will try to look into to try to see if they can prove or disprove what your calendar and travel log is showing. Next slide. Okay, this one here is I've heard a lot of people over the years say that you should sell your home and move out. Get rid of your homes in California and make sure you cut connections completely. And so you get rid of any homes you have, whether it's a vacation home that you used to have for, many of our clients have multiple homes out here. So it's always a good idea. I would say that is the best idea, so as you have tiers of things to think about whenever you're getting out of California, it's like, and cutting your ties is what's the best. And the best is always to, sell your residences and move out. The second best would be basically to lease out your residence. Maybe you don't want to sell it. Maybe it's a great investment. Maybe there's some other reasons why you don't want to necessarily get rid of it. Could be a family heirloom, something like that. And so then you just lease it out. And then that's probably the second best. The third best is actually keep it as a vacation home and always go back there and use it. But that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world either. As long as you can, again, prove your days and prove that you just kept it because you wanted to have a place to stay when you come to Los Angeles, because you come to Los Angeles still now and then. The other thing to take into account when you go and move into a new state, you purchase a new state, purchase a new place, is that you want to, with Google and everything now, Google Maps and so on, and all the, access to these kind of things. Basically, the FTB will just look and say, okay, well, I'm just going to look up and see what the house, how big is the house, how much did it cost, where is it, what is it? Is it an apartment? Is it not? There's, if you're owning a huge home out here, if you own a huge home for $50 million or something out here, and you buy a $2 million condo in another state, the factors are going to be weighing more to, okay, well, what's going on there? Why do you have such a small house compared to what you used to have? Is that really your new principal residence, and so on? So you want to make sure that you take those kind of things into account and say, okay, where are my houses? What's the cost? What's the square footage? All those things. One funny small little thing that's been happening, I think, lately is I've noticed that people that have been moving out of California and they get audited, a number of them are selling their houses, but many times, and this is probably just something that all CPAs have, been telling people all over the years to do. We're all guilty of not necessarily doing this. I've seen that residency audits where the FTB will come in and do initially audit the residency question, but then if they're finding that that's not really going well for them, they'll switch over and audit the house sale, especially like if that house sale was also in the year that the person left the residency. So in a sense, what they do then is they make it into they'll say, okay, well, residency is fine. You win on that, but now we're going to look at the basis of the house and see if your capital gains were reported correctly. And a lot of people have owned homes for 20, 30 years. And so, they've done improvements and stuff over the years. So it's just one thing to consider if you're going to be selling your home when you leave California. Make sure you can, before you do that, take a look at your basis support and see what you can do there. Then a couple of little things too, like here in California, I think you have your little homeowners exemption, which is worth like $70 or $80 or something like that. But nonetheless, you get rid of that. If you go to a new state, Texas actually has a very substantial tax saving homeowners exemption. So you want to do that if you go to that state. Art, charity, art, household goods, that kind of stuff. If you have a whole household full of Picassos, you leave that here, and you buy a bunch of prints in your new home. That's all that weighs in the factor. So again, over and over on this stuff, you want to just basically take a look at your overall factors. What we'll do a lot of times is basically put a checklist together and go down and say, okay, well, here's this factor's good, this factor's not. Here's where you need to do a little better on this, and furniture, those kind of things. I mean, if you sell your furniture, for instance, from the house, or maybe include it as part of the lease, that's the best. So on the factor list, that would be the best thing to do. Next slide. Okay, and we talked about this a little bit earlier too. Resigning the memberships of resign on the boards and that kind of thing as much as possible. There could be something that you really like, and so you want to keep it, but in general, try to at least, if you're in a country club here, try to at least join a country club there as well. Cancel the voter registration here, register the new state, get the new driver's license in the new state. Vehicles, just make sure that you don't have 10 vehicles here and 1 vehicle in the new state. You want to make that be a little bit more even. And then of course the wills and trusts. When you move to a new state, you're going to, it's not necessarily, well, it's partially taxed, but it's like the wills and trusts, you want to probably update that to include the fact that you're now living in a new state. Most of the trusts have things in there about what law it's supposed to be under and so on. So that's also a little helpful fact. Next slide. Okay, this is just, again, there's more of these factors, to try to get to, medical professionals, try to at least get a dentist, those kind of things. Move bank accounts if you can. Investment property, arguably, I would say, a lot of people have investment property all over the country now, so it's not crucial that you dispose of it. But if you can, again, under the theory of just try to discontinue as much of your ties with California as possible. And then the other thing that they will look at, especially for anyone who owns a company or is, a CEO of a company and so on, if the headquarters are still here and you just have to be like the one person who's living in another state, they will ask more questions about that. So what you want to do is, if possible, and this also comes into play with my last slide about the LLCs and the allocations and all that kind of stuff. If you can move, if there's a possibility of moving company headquarters or at least getting an office in your new state, that's very important. And then last but not least, there's the family pets situation, and that sort of sounds funny, but that's come up in numerous court cases. I know when we went to when I was arguing with the FTB for the guy in Puerto Rico, we sent pictures of him, his wife, and his pets down there. He had a bunch of dogs. We did that. We actually did like statements from the people that work, from this company out here, from the CEO who said, yeah, we only call him on the phone. We only do quarterly meetings here in person and so on. And so that's another thing to consider is just, what can you do there with the pets? Some people, it could be that, as funny as it sounds, sometimes there might be someone back here. But if you're saying that you live in another state and your pet, though, remains behind, I forget what it was. One case, there was one case, a couple cases out where it's like the dogs actually came into play in consideration for the judge. And then there was one, I think it was a teddy bear or something like that. Where did the person take their teddy bear, and where was the teddy bear house? So there's like weird little things that they actually get into above and beyond just your days and your travel logs. So all in all of these things you want to take into account and try to, have your list and try to have everything weighed on your side as much as possible and as little on the California side as possible for all of this stuff. Next slide. Okay, this is where the publication 1100 that I mentioned, calculating your income in the exit year, you want to time the timing of the income comes into play. So yeah, you usually do want to think about this a little bit going forward, because if you go through the different types of income, you got wages. Wages are sort of what they are. Wages of where you're doing the services. Sale of real estate. If you're going to sell real estate, like where this would come into play, if you're selling California real estate, you're pretty much going to pay California tax on the California real estate. But if you think about it, if you're thinking of selling, if you're thinking of moving, so say in 1 year you're thinking of you're going to move to Texas, and you also happen to have some property outside the state of California that you were also thinking of selling, for instance, an investment property or a vacation home in Aspen that you decide you want to get rid of. Well, you may want to time the sale of that real estate that's outside of California to coincide with when you get to the new state. So that way, at least when you get to the new state, you can be taxed at that point, as opposed to, paying the California tax before you leave. Because if you're living in California and you sell real estate in another state, you still have to pay California tax on that real estate. The income flowing through pass-through entities, this and the crystallization of fees comes into play, where, especially if you're running a company, when do you get paid, and when does the income actually come through to you? So there are a couple of different ways that you can do this, and basically you can specifically, when you leave in that year that you're half California, half Nevada. If you do not know when the income came through, but you get a K-1, and it says, okay, here's your amount of income. If you can, and you can specifically identify the income that happened while you were in California versus when it happened in Nevada, you can use that method in order to pick up the income in the right state. If you don't know when it is, and a lot of people invest in many things that there's just really no idea, well, then at that point you may have to just do the sort of allocation of days method. So if you make $1 million and it's reported on the K-1 to you, and you have no idea when that actually income was earned, then you would just do an allocation of days between the two states for the year. And then finally, the other thing to take into account, and it's just more of a fact-based pattern for all this, is just things like suspended passive losses, NOLs, things like that. I mean, you could have a California NOL and move out of California, and then the NOL will just basically sort of sit there. So there's things that you can think about to say, okay, well, if I have a California NOL, for instance, maybe I want to try to, I can trigger some gain or something like that before I leave California, so I at least use that up. So just some stuff to think about there. That gets into the details of your actual tax return itself. Next slide. Items to consider when you're moving into California. That's another thing to think about, because when you're coming into California, you have to remember that it's, let's say you're moving from Florida, which is not a community property state and doesn't have any income tax, and then you're moving into California. Well, clearly, when you get to California, your situation is going to be a lot different than it probably was down in Florida. So one of the main things, and I've seen this happen over and over with people that move into California, if they're unaware of the community property laws, they won't realize that there's, A, legal issues they should be dealing with, and B, that there's now potentially different ways to do the tax return. This happens a lot of times with, there could be people that are filing separately. Maybe one spouse has all the income, the other one doesn't. Well, if they've been filing separately, but it's community property, well, now maybe you're supposed to put 50-50 on there. So there's some little technical details to deal with on exactly how you're doing it. But the main thing I've seen is that I think just from from sort of a legal and community standpoint, that some people just don't realize that, oh, now I'm here and I've got to follow the community property rules, and so that's important to talk with the people about. Federal and California, they don't always conform to the laws, so there could be stuff like I point out down below, like the qualified small business stock. California doesn't really follow that. They didn't really follow the qualified opportunity zone. There's a bunch of other differences between. Sometimes California suspends their NOL and the feds don't. So anyone who's coming into California and has these tax issues, potentially they should think about these things first, because you don't want to move in here and then sell or do something or invest in something that you could have done beforehand and had taken advantage of the other states' rules versus coming into California. And then it's sort of a similar thing with almost reverse of leaving California. When you come into California, you have to start thinking about these kind of things as well. So like if you're going to sell your house in Florida and move to California and buy a house out here, well, make sure you sell the house in Florida before you move to California, because if you move to California and then sell the house in Florida, well, then you're going to pay California tax on the house in Florida that you didn't pay tax on. So there's all those kind of little things to think about. Installment sales, think about how that's working. Do you want to pick up, once you get into California and you're getting payments on an installment sale, are you potentially going to have California income on that? Same thing with retirement income. If you were debating whether to take a distribution and pay tax or something like that on it, maybe do that before you get into California. So there's all this little stuff before you get into California. You always want to think, okay, what's going to happen? It's almost like you should do a sort of a before and after type analysis to say, okay, well, here's what would happen if I did this here while I'm in this state. Here's what happens if I go to that state. I'll decide one way or another based on that kind of number. Next slide. The California trust. I wanted to just touch base on this California trust versus non-California trust. So for anyone who's moving, this is especially important if you're going to be moving into California. If you're moving into California and you have a grantor trust, so let's say you're in Texas, you set up a grantor trust, and then now you move into California. The grantor trust is taxed by the residency of the grantor. So any income that's flowing through that trust will then be taxed on the grantor's 1040. So if you're living in Texas and you've got a grantor trust, well then clearly you're not paying state tax on that. But if you move to California and you still have this grantor trust, you're now going to be paying California tax as well on top of the federal tax. So that's why I wanted to bring it up, is that it's sort of another thing to think about when you're moving in or out of the state. You got to think about all these different things and the different rules. So, theoretically, there could be a reason why you say, well, you know what, we'll just turn this into a non-grantor trust before we get into California. So that way, the trust will pay its own tax. So you don't get the benefit of the grantor trust versus non-grantor trust thing. You're not getting that sort of gift tax-free payment of the tax anymore. But you're also not paying California tax if you can set it up as a non-grantor trust outside of California. So that was the main point I wanted to bring up on that. The other thing is, a lot of times if people are migrating out of California or they want to migrate out of California, it could be that you look at it and say, well, what is the difference? If you're in California, you might lean to having a non-grantor trust outside of California. Or if you're going to be moving outside of California, well, then maybe you want to set up a grantor trust because that will follow with you when you go over there. So there's just a couple of things to think about there as to who's going to be paying the income and where the residency of the grantor is. For non-grantor trusts, and this is the part where this is way beyond the scope of talking here. For the non-grantor trust, that California, each state is different. Some states look at New York looks at it one way. You got to, basically, you probably all know this, that, when you're going to a different state, you got to think about, okay, well, how is that trust going to be taxed in that state? California looks at the trustees and they look at the beneficiaries. They look at the location, and then they also look at numbers. So you could get like a 50-50 type tax situation if you had one trustee in California, one trustee in say Chicago. So when sometimes people that are not moving out of the state will look at setting up a non-grantor trust, non-California non-grantor trust. And that is also something that anyone who's, any kind of person who's living outside the state has to be aware of as well, that if you pick a California trustee and you're not living in California, but you pick a California trustee, you could have inadvertently sucked your trust into California taxation. So you have to look at that. The beneficiaries for California, they will look at whether or not it's contingent or non-contingent. So in other words, are you required to get the income? Are you going to get the money when you turn 18? Do you have a crummy power? Those kind of things. So it's just all of these little things to think about when you're setting up trusts or moving in or out of California. And then also just one little note is California, I've seen be very aggressive about also looking at the other people that have some sort of, arguably a fiduciary role within a trust. So they will sometimes argue over, well, what's this trust protector doing? What's the investment advisor doing? Do you have is there a distribution committee? those kind of things. So at the end of the day, what I've seen people do is recommend, as much as possible, if you do not want your trust to be subject to the California tax, to not have anyone in there who has anything to do with California during that time. Next slide. And then I'll quickly. Oh yeah, just two quick little things on this. When you're if you're going to be selling California real estate, and or you have California real estate investment income or California sourced income, basically it doesn't really help all that much to set up a trust outside of California, because you're still going to end up paying tax on the California tax on the California sourced income stuff. The other thing to think about is if you're going to be making distributions to anybody, let's say your beneficiary, you want to make a distribution to the beneficiary, but the beneficiary is still living in California, but they might be moving out in 6 months. This gets into the planning ahead. Well, maybe you wait to make the distribution until the beneficiary moves out of California. And at that point, you can make a distribution. Not only does this could potentially play into the whole, contingent, non-contingent, but it also could play into, well, the beneficiary wouldn't have to pick up any income then necessarily because they moved out of California when they got the distribution. And then finally, last but not least, you can't really play you got to be careful. I think California is the only state in the union that has like the throwback tax. So there's a whole complicated calculation and stuff that you have to do there. But basically, you have to remember that California will try and tax income that was maybe earned outside, earned while the trust was not California. But then if you bring the money back into California, potentially you can end up paying some additional tax on top of what you would normally think you'd pay. Next slide. And last but not least, before, because I want to leave a little bit of time for any questions or anything, always take into account, if you own any pass-through entities, all of this stuff should be taken into account. Your location, I mentioned before, the location of the headquarters, where your real estate is. The different states have different sales factors, that you can potentially be using. Ownership rules, like for instance, if you move from that this has a little bit more to do with the trust, but if you want to bring a non-grantor trust into California or have a non-grantor trust here in California, you potentially could have, like if you change from a grantor to non-grantor, you can have a grantor trust that owns an S corp. That's no problem, but you just have to be careful with the non-grantor trust and so on. So like when I was talking about before, switching your grantor trust to a non-grantor trust and then moving into California, you potentially get a problem there. The other thing is where I've seen this happen is people will move out of California. They'll own a company. A lot of times, especially if it's real estate or there's some business operations in California still, they'll themselves move out of California, and then they'll think, oh, okay, well, now I don't have to pay tax on anything from this company. Well, it's not really necessarily the case, because the company itself would still have to be, subject to the apportionment and allocation rules. So you could end up in a weird situation where, you have a company in California that you're an owner of, you move to Texas, you no longer have tax at your level, but the company still has to look at how this is all working. So they could have a property in Nevada that they sell, and you live in Texas, but theoretically you still have to pay California tax on a piece of that property. So all things there's just to think about when you're taking into account, buying and selling companies and doing all this kind of stuff, because if it's flowing through from an LLC, partnership, or S corp, you have to take into account those apportionment and allocation rules. And then next slide. And that's it. These are the three. Like, if I was going to recommend any kind of little, just sort of basic starting point before you even got into researching cases and actually getting into like the California code sections and whatnot. I've over the years, I've always found these three things to be very helpful for, let's take a look and see what is California looking for here, so we can sort of gauge how we do this. That's it for today.
Thank you, Robert. I do have several questions. I heard you say multiple times it's vague, so maybe it's going to be vague. But a couple questions. When you're talking about the trusts, grantor and non-grantor trusts, If there is a student from California who, let's say go to Penn State and decides that they're going to stay there, work there, live there, can they change the residency, and does that affect the non-grantor trust, or does it not because of their age or?
Theoretically, and again, yes, it does. As you know, it depends. It's really going to depend on how the sort of default thinking that I think the FTB would have is that, well, you're just a college student. Your residency and domicile is still at home. So if you're going to move, it could be slightly different if you're a grad student. For instance, I actually when I was at Penn State, I worked with a bunch of grad students there. I worked at the landscaping agricultural school or something like that over the summer, and there's a bunch of scientists there getting their going for their masters and PhDs and so on. And they had moved there, so they were still technically in school, young 20s and whatnot, but they were a little older, and a couple of them were married and so on. So that's a little different than being like an 18-year-old kid who's going away to Penn State and just being there. And then it's hard to, you've not only got the dependent rules on the parents thing, but then you've also got, well, how are they paying for college? Theoretically, though, I mean, you could come up with a fact pattern where the person doesn't really have any, they're sort of, they just move away from home. They move to another state, and they move to Penn State, and their parents aren't paying for their college, and they're on their own. They're paying for their college on their own and doing their things, and they just come back and visit on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and something like that. And so I think that if you look at it that way, this is where it depends, because it's like each fact pattern is different. The general most common fact pattern is that the college kid is still just going to be treated as if he lives back in California with his folks.
Okay. You didn't touch on sourced income, and maybe this isn't an issue, but if you are all your income is sourced in California, like from CalPERS or pension or something, but you don't domicile or live here, is that an issue for taxes or?
That is one, and I purposely stayed away from all that because of those the sort of the pension rules and the IRA rules and the 401k rules and all that kind of stuff. That's like an area where it's just because they're so regulated and everything. And I know California was trying to go after that for a while. I think at the end of the day, if you're getting a pension or you're doing something, the general again goes to where are you living now? But there are some funny things that and I know California somehow they might want to have a tie back in certain instances and so on, depending on how you've earned your money and how the fund is set up and all that. So that's why it's similar to like installment sales and so on. Anytime you're getting something from when you earned it back in California, I just would recommend, instead of just listening to me, I'd look up and really dig into that, especially if the numbers are big enough. I think like if you're just a general guy and you move to, like my dad gets a pension, and one of the few people who get pensions anymore. So he got a pension in Florida. He doesn't still pay Pennsylvania tax, even though he lived there for 35 years. So I think that's one of those big, it depends. And if the money, his money is not big enough for anyone to care. But if you had a big number and you're big, that kind of stuff, I would look that up just because there's weird rules in that area.
Okay. On the corporate office thing, when you were talking about setting up new corporate offices, in your experience, is it a percentage of staff who have to be there? Like how many employees or?
Again, it's all facts and circumstances. So the important thing is that, you have something there that's not just, and again, you don't have to do this. I mean, that also will affect, your company allocations and apportionments too, by moving it. So it may or may not be that you want to do it, and it may not be feasible. But if you're in a situation where you can do it and you do it, that helps with your factors, because again, it's all listing of factors. So if you just happen to have if you move to a state where there's an office and you just make sure that you have an office there, that's okay. You don't have to move your headquarters. It's just, if you have the ability, if it's your company and you have the ability to move the headquarters, well, that sure is a big factor in your favor. So that's how that works. And, and if you can't move all the people, because we've had this situation here recently where they moved some. So like the CFO moved a couple of, and so they have a substantial office in Texas. But I would say that a fair amount of people still stayed in California.
I know we're over time, so I just have two more questions. I hope that's okay. One is, given the number of people who are living, and traveling in their senior years now in mobile homes, and like they never are anywhere, is it where they have their driver's license or where the car is registered? Like, who gets to claim them if they're traveling around all the time and not, owning a home anymore?
If they, that's a good, that's a good question. I actually had this conversation in a slightly different way. It was like the guy was talking about getting on a boat, living on a boat, just traveling around on his boat. But I think what you end up having is some sort of weird, like like if you're in California, and you're going to say, okay, I'm just going to drive around in my mobile home from here on out. I guess in theory, you could say that you don't live in any state. If you sold your house and you have no house, no tie, no nothing to California, but if you keep a house in California, you just drive your mobile home around. California, I think, could probably go back to that whole domicile thing and say, well, you didn't really give up your house. You're just temporarily driving around right now and you're living in a mobile home, but yet you still have your home in Hermosa Beach or, Downey or something. So I think like if you're going to be doing this, you'd have to really walk through that and say, if I'm going to live in a mobile home and travel around a mobile home, I think you probably want to err on the side if I got to sell my house too.
Okay. All right, I'll just take this as the last question because of time. There were a few people who asked about the throwback rule, and if you can expand on that, if you have time.
Oh, geez, yeah, and that would be part of that whole other non-grantor, California non-grantor trust conversation, because basically what it is it has to do with, if you've got, say you got, because remember the two-part test is I'll try to make this as simple as possible. But I'd recommend looking this up too, and there's a formula that you would end up doing on the form 541. So there's like a form you have to do, and you have to fill it out, and you basically look at the couple years. So this has to do with if you've got, say, a non-California trust with non-California trustees, but you've got California beneficiaries. However, they're contingent, because remember it's a two-part test. It's got where's the trustee or trustees, and where are the beneficiaries, and then it's really a three-part test, because if you have a California beneficiary, then you have to look at whether they're contingent or non-contingent. Not if they're contingent and they're just sort of, there's no money. Let's say they're contingent, and so you're not paying any California tax on this thing, but then 2 years into it, you make a distribution into the California beneficiary. Well, now at that point, they basically become non-contingent. You have to look at, okay, well, was there actual income that would have been taxed to that trust in those previous 2 years? So you don't just look at the year of the distribution, you look at, or the change. Let's say that you had a trustee change and move in there. Then you have to look at, there's these really weird, complicated rules about how you have to look at the previous 2 years, and you end up paying tax on additional years that you wouldn't have expected necessarily. So it's an important thing to think through. So that's probably not that clear, but that's basically what it revolves around.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. Again, I know with the tax deadline and your own, just clients, you had a lot going on. So I appreciate you taking the time to present to us today. For everybody that attended, we sent you a packet of information with Robert's slides, his contact information, his bio is all in there. If you have additional questions, I encourage you to become his client so he can help you out. And if you want to join us for our next event, it's Wednesday, November 14th. Alan Cuttrow, Mitchell Silverberg, and Nupp will be presenting on My Client Wants to Set Up a Private Foundation. What do I tell them? I think that'll be a tremendous opportunity for people who are interested in this. And if we can be of help to you, Dan, Natella, myself, any of our colleagues here at the foundation, I encourage you to be in touch with us. Thank you again for being here, Robert. Again, my thanks to you for all the time you took to present and prepare for this. And I look forward to talking to you after the Penn State Michigan game.
Well, one of us is not going to look forward to talking to the other.
All right. Thank you all.